Well, my clock has struck noon here in Chicago, so we are going to get started. Welcome to Exploring Religion in Ancient Egypt, a conversation with Graham School instructor Brian Smith. My name is Seth Green, and as the Dean of the Graham School, it is a great pleasure to welcome you virtually to the University of Chicago and to our school. For those who are new to the Graham School, we are part of the original founding vision of this university. When William Rainey Harper was establishing this university in partnership with John D. Rockefeller and others, pictured in front of you, there was a plan to revolutionize university study in this country. And at the core of that plan was an idea that you would take the cutting edge ideas of this great university and you would find ways not only to bring it to the undergraduate and graduate divisions, but to a new audience of lifelong learners. And so the University of Chicago established the first extension in the United States for liberal arts learning. And we have been trailblazing a path of lifelong learning for the last 131 years, including being the origin of distance learning in this country when in 1895, we set up the first correspondence classes that students could take for credit when they could not be in person. Obviously, a trend that has continued, especially in recent years, in the new form of the Zoom that we're on now. And in the 20s, 30s, 40s, we were even in the role of hosting some university lectures in places like Soldier Field. And so this is a school that has found new ways to constantly be bringing the cutting edge ideas of our great university to all learners in ways that really enrich lives across all ages and stages. Today, we are a school that has 4 different types of programmatic offerings. We have a Master of Liberal Arts that is among the most respected and rigorous in the world. We have a basic program of liberal education for adults where you can immerse yourself in deep discovery of the great books through a discussion, Socratic tradition-based seminar style. We have an open enrollment, which is where we have incredible instructors like Brian, who you'll hear from, teaching courses across all of the different disciplines of this university. Today, we'll be journeying into ancient Egypt. And then we have annual programs that allow you to learn about the future of museum publishing all the way to better knowing your Chicago. What unites everything we do are 4 consistent elements. We are bringing the best of this extraordinary university where big ideas are born that change and challenge the world. We are always trying to tie back our courses and our learning to a liberal arts core with a belief that those ideas across time and space help to better understand our world today. We have eminent faculty and instructors, and you're about to get to know one of them. And most importantly, we have all of you. We believe, the most ambitious learners in the world. And there's a great saying that my colleague Kendall Sharp uses. He says, we put the adult in adult learning. And as a new dean, I have had the joy of visiting more than 20 classrooms and seeing into the work that's happening. And what's striking to me, having been in faculty roles for the 8 years prior to coming here and having taught students who were being graded and teaching a class that was an elective, is even with all of that context, I have still walked into our rooms and been truly in awe of the seriousness with which the learners at the Graham School embrace their curiosity. Most of the students I've seen have been reading the texts that are shared for that week multiple times. And what it means is that in addition to learning from the incredible faculty and instructors, you all have incredible opportunities to learn from one another. And so I'll just close by saying that we have many opportunities to glimpse into our work. Today is an example. So are these 4 upcoming opportunities. And with that, let me get on to the reason that you are all here, which is to have a conversation with Brian Smith. And let me apologize that I apparently did a very poor job of editing as I'm looking at my screen because we had a conversation on Monday with Richard Payne. So here I will show you Brian Smith so that you can see the actual person we are conversing with today. So Brian has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and archaeology and has excavated in India, Thailand, and Egypt. He received a master's degree in fine arts in ancient Egyptian art and archaeology, and also earned a master's degree in Egyptology from the University of Chicago. His interests are in socioeconomic interpretations of material culture, which we'll be talking about today, particularly ceramics, art historical styles such as painting, sculpture, and architecture, and religious ideology as reflected in the behavioral systems observed in the archaeological record. And so, Ryan, let me just start before we jump into the content by talking a bit about how you approach understanding ancient Egypt, because as I just described in your biography, you have been trained as an archaeologist, but you also have lenses as someone who understands art history and as someone who knows a lot about linguistics. And I'm curious, kind of to start with, to kind of hear you share a bit about how field archaeologists understand the world, including how you use materials with all of those lenses to glimpse into past societies.
All right. First of all, thank you, Seth, and thank you everyone for showing up. I've got quite the crowd, so that's not intimidating at all. The responsibility of a field archaeologist is primarily meticulousness, photographing, measuring, doing elevations, doing drawings, hand drawings, in order to best replicate the context that you are excavating, whether it is in Egypt or it's in Nubia or it's in Assyria. Our responsibility is to best replicate the context. There are so many collections across the world who, unfortunately, in the past 200 years or so of archaeology, took these items out of context because they were willing to fill the cabinets of European and American museums with the pretty things in exchange for funding. Scientific archaeology is basically about 100 years old or so. William Flinders Petrie, of course, very famous Egyptologist, really started, especially with ceramics, really started seriating and looking at the chronology and the evolution and the morphology of material cultures. And of course, many, many other people have followed him in his footsteps. So the primary responsibility that field archaeologists have, and again, I'm no longer a field archaeologist, I've moved on since, into the lecture room, is to maintain that context and preserve that context. Even the Grand Egyptian Museum today, which is going to open hopefully, inshallah, in a year, is recontextualizing older collections from the Old Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square and the older Egyptian Museum at Fustat, and they're recontextualizing them. Instead of putting them in thematic or purely thematic collections, they're putting them also in chronological contexts. So you've got earliest monument, you've got the earliest kings, you've got earliest ceramic evidence, the Nagada periods of the prehistoric period of ancient Egypt and the ancient Nile Valley. You've also got the incorporation of Nubian material, which is going to be extremely important. The contextual, for us as visitors to the Grand Egyptian Museum when it opens, the important thing is going to be looking at, let's say, a body of a priest or a nobleman or a noblewoman, and looking at the objects that had previously been separated from that mummy, from that body. Now they are being gathered together as if you were looking at the excavation itself. And so you have to understand the bigger picture of not only scientific methodology and approach in theory and practice in the field, but you also have to be able to make meaning for these objects. These are real people. These were real people. And we can talk about that a little bit later because of the importance and significance I feel that religion has to the ancient Egyptians as real living, once living individuals.
Well, so let's jump in now to the world that you are describing. And your upcoming course is called Temple of the World, and it builds on this idea of ancient Egypt as a uniquely religious and spiritual place. And so I'm curious, using those lenses that you just described and kind of talking about how you can interpret from material culture and from all of these other elements. Can you talk about the way that religion played a significant role in ancient Egyptian society? And then can you share how you see that role manifest? So what are the University of Chicago? What are the evidence points, kind of to support that understanding of the role of religion in Egyptian society?
Well, religious belief goes back far into antiquity. Some of our earliest graves that we have in the Nile Valley, both in Nubia and in Egypt, um, we have these religious monuments, like the very famous down in Sudan, the very famous mark that's currently outside of the National Museum of Sudan, which was located in a different place, called Nabta Playa. And it's basically these series of maybe 20 stones or so. The tallest is like maybe 3 feet, and they're all arranged in a circle, very conveniently and curiously looking exactly like Stonehenge, as far as having these primary parallel stones facing the east, facing the west. It's all encompassed in the circle. So that's something that tells us that, okay, at least the peoples of the Nile Valley in that region during this time period, 7,000 BCE-ish, do believe in some sort of at least calendrical system. And from later on, and we have to be hesitant about this, about retro dating, right? Religious beliefs from one time period and saying, oh, well, these people were doing the same thing, so therefore they must believe the same thing. We have to be careful about that and the interpretation of archaeological data and context. Burials, obviously, throughout the Nile Valley are very significant. We have most of the earliest ones from the from mid Neolithic, late Mesolithic to early Neolithic, are circular in composition. They're buried directly into the ground. The corpses are actually buried in a fetal position. Their heads are facing south. And the reason why their heads are facing south and their faces are facing east is because east is where the sun rises. And that's something that's going to be consistent in ancient Egyptian ideology about the rebirth of the sun. The fact that the dead travel with the sun, enter with the sun into the afterlife when the sun sets. The reason why they're facing south is because that's the source of the Nile. That's the source of life for the people of the Nile Valley. And so great religious celebrations were observed in the historic period when the Nile Valley started to rise. Hymns to the god Hapi, H-A-P-I, Hapi, were sung in joyous celebration of, in the middle of the summer when it's the hottest, the driest, the Nile is low and slow moving. Then suddenly, when things are the worst, as far as, the environment, the climate goes, then suddenly you have this blessing of the Nile inundation that is giving life back to the fields, depositing this rich black silt, filling the canals with water, employing the peoples, who are farmers and canal diggers, clearing out and dredging these canals in order to make accessible the flooding of the Nile River into these kind of liminal areas in the cultivation to water the fields, to create food. And so the natural cycles of the Nile River is intrinsically important and is definitely one of the main, if not the main, inspirations for the religious ideology and religious beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. The rising and setting of the sun, these cyclical returns of death and life and rebirth, which is also seen in the flooding of the Nile River itself. The flooding of the Nile River is considered to be the embodiment of this god Hapi, also considered to be the tears of the goddess Isis when she was weeping for her dead husband, ostensibly the first king of Egypt in the mythology. And so these tears filled the Nile Valley out of mourning, but also gave fertility to the Nile. So there's this constant back and forth of life and death, ultimately being connected. And this is manifest in the art historical record, the texts that we have, the sculptures and reliefs, small objects finds, as well as the very institution and architecture of the temple itself and what that means. I don't want to give away too many spoilers because I want to class. So
Well, and on that note, can we just ask briefly, is that in terms of the course, some of the material that you'll cover? Will you be looking at different types of evidence, both texts and actual ceramics and material culture as well?
yes, yes, absolutely. Again, my primary shift, went from field archaeology into more social history and material archaeology and how that reflects the life of the people. Because again, these were real people. We need to understand them as such. I think it's kind of difficult for a lot of people approaching Egyptian material to see these kind of flat two-dimensional images where the face is in profile and you've got the torso is forward and you've got the legs in profile. They seem very unapproachable in some ways as far as the art historical style goes, as far as even the sculptures go. We've got basically six different sorts of compositions for kings, pharaohs, scribes, members of the royalty. The most common is going to be the one that's very completely tight, where the arms are down at the side of the body and the face is facing forward. And there's a concern for this from the Egyptian mindset in that if you have such what is called a closed sculptural composition, that's going to help preserve the actual body of the sculpture, as opposed to if you had discobolos, right? The classical Greek or early Hellenistic discus thrower from Greece, where the arms are outreached and everything is everywhere. All the limbs are everywhere. The Egyptians are going to approach their art styles and they're concerned primarily with preservation far much more than the Greeks would. And that makes sense, even though I'm not a classicist, that makes sense because their approaches to death are different. How they
Right.
celebrate people are going to be different in death and in life. So that's a really interesting.
Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, and I've always noticed that, but now the explanation gives so much more context to why you see it in that more consolidated form, and understanding how it's a protection. You begin to make sense of how much it is aimed toward that religious value in addition to the potential aesthetic. Let me come to a really interesting part of Egyptian history. Also, I know you've taught on this, which is where religion is challenged in ancient Egypt. And I'm particularly thinking about Akhenaten. And, this is the mid 1300s BC. He rules for 17 years. He challenges this idea of polytheism, which had been core prior to his reign. He's replaced by his son King Tut. So, it ends up being just a moment in some ways. Just talk a bit about that moment, and then what happens afterward to kind of change back or change forward, because it's a new normal afterward. I just think it's a really interesting kind of episode in this overall history of exploring religion in ancient Egypt.
Right. It absolutely is. And those of you who like Gwen and Dr. Skelf, are probably familiar with the role of Akhenaten, who Akhenaten is. I was chatting with Seth earlier that basically you get 10 Egyptologists in one room, you shout the name Akhenaten, and then you get 15 different opinions. Very controversial figure. We've got a lot of opinions over the past more than 100 years, including Sigmund Freud, who chimed in with some very interesting theories, which I will cover. Much to your point, Seth, I will be covering material and textual sources in class. Akhenaten reigned at the height of the 18th dynasty. So out of Egypt's chronology, we have 31 dynasties. If you want to include Dynasty 0, some people do. Generally, it's still approved that Dynasty 0, the pre-kings of Egypt, are now included within the chronology. But then you also have to include the Macedonian kings later on, the descendants of Alexander the Great. So King Akhenaten is pretty much smack dab right in the middle, the 18th dynasty. His early life is as a prince of his father, Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III had another son who was lined up to be the prince or to be the king, to be the regent of Amenhotep III. This prince named Thutmosis died. We don't know the context. So there's some drama to begin the subsequent drama of what Akhenaten did in the next 17 years. The idea that he has, and I've read a couple of different opinions on this, and I'm not quite convinced of challenging the idea of pure monotheism. Some scholars have brought up some interesting ideas about henotheism, where you agree and say, okay, well, there are all these other gods, but I'm only going to worship this one God. But then if you look at the text, like the great hymn and the lesser hymn to the Aten, this god that Akhenaten made manifest, it wasn't his sole creation. The Aten, in reference to the sun god, goes back to the Middle Kingdom, possibly even further. I don't recall any Old Kingdom references. So it's not an unfamiliar deity to the Egyptians.
Right.
But Akhenaten preferred this deity and ostensibly shut down the temples, at least in Thebes and other many places, moved his capital from Thebes, the traditional family, ancestral homeland, if you will, the ancestral city, from Thebes up into a new virgin site. And he even tells us on his stele, there was no god who was worshipped here. There was no goddess who was worshipped here. This is virgin land. This is virgin territory. So it's very intentional that Akhenaten, in his quote unquote revolution, that he is making a break from tradition, a very intentional break from tradition. A lot of other details about his reign we'll cover in the class in the upcoming course. Nicholas Reeves, however, in the past 3 or 4 years, has brought up some very interesting theories and ideas about who actually followed Akhenaten. There is this enigmatic figure named Smenkhara, and Smenkhara actually shares some titulary with Akhenaten's wife, the famous Nefertiti. So did Nefertiti actually take over as a regent over King Tut, who's only like 9 or 10 years old, when he should have been the legal king? Who's taking over that power? Is Nefertiti actually usurping that power, reigning in his name, but then reigning in her own name? That's also, again, one of these kind of conjectural things that a lot of people are talking about during this rather tumultuous era. King Tut dies. Eventually, Smenkhara completely disappears. King Tut dies. The next king is a man who reigns for about 3 or 4 years, named Ay, A-Y. And then after that, after this religious coup, if you will, after this religious coup of Akhenaten and his descendants, then we get the rise of the military. And the rise of the military comes from the north in Lower Egypt. The descendants of these military families, these generals, Ramses I, Seti I, Ramses II, and so on and so forth, where their power in Egypt, as well as being, kind of the preeminent god kings that they proclaim to be, which is traditional, but their main military source, or their main source of establishing
is military.
Is the military.
Yeah.
And so you've got kind of this, one extreme of religious extremism, and then you've got on the other hand, a rather militant extremism in a way. So it's interesting to see that kind of waffling back and forth within maybe 5 generations of 5, 6 generations of these kings, this transition from the 18th to the 19th dynasty.
Well, so I have one more question, and then we're going to come to the questions from all of you. So please start chatting them. We're going to start with Tom Smith's question here. But this is a question that you knew about in advance, Brian, because one of the things that struck me in our prep conversation was, how you really understand these individuals in the most humanistic way, right? As individuals with personalities, with deep human emotions, with loves, with anxieties. Yeah. And you see that in the historical record, even though obviously the historical record and what can be written down then is very different than, the level of writing and documentation today. And you mentioned to me and shared with me a poem that, was just a great example. But I wanted to maybe ask you to share that with the group. And I did see a note here that your volume may be a little bit quiet for some. So if you want to just even speak up as you read the poem, and speak right into your screen, that might be ideal.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't actually pull up the poem, but I can pretty much summarize it for you.
Perfect. Go for it. Yeah.
So it's a poem from a period just after one of the first, let's say, awkward periods after the decline of the Old Kingdom. We have the first intermediate period, so about 100 years, 120 years or so of economic and ecological crises, recorded low Nile floods. But the primary, the document that I was mentioning before is, again, well known for those in the Egyptological circles, a dispute of a man with his Ba, where we have this unnamed author who took the time to write out rather enigmatic and sometimes often garbled, especially because of the lacunae, the parts of the papyrus that is missing, to actually understand the end of the story. We don't have the end of the story, and that's frustrating as well. But what it is a discussion of a man who is weary of life, who's tired of life, and he is discussing with his Ba, his soul, and we'll talk about constituents of what makes up a human being: the Ren, the Ba, the Ka, the Sak, all these other, kind of like an onion layer of what makes us us.
Yeah.
In the Egyptian context. But this individual is basically lamenting life. I have no friend here. There is not a friend to be found. The robber is wealthy, and women who used to sleep in fine linen are now beggars. And so this describes this period in as a lamentation almost, as a potential for suicide. This man is talking about killing himself, and we don't have his name. So whoever wrote this down was truly feeling this, I feel, was truly feeling this. Maybe I'm being overly romantic or overly sentimental or empathetic or whatever, but someone took the time to write this down in papyrus. And papyrus is not a cheap material in ancient Egyptian society. If you want to make a note, write a poem, even honestly, draw dirty pictures, erotic art, you use limestone flakes called ostraca. You don't use an expensive papyrus roll necessarily to write down anonymously the emotional depression and anxiety that you're feeling in an uncertain time. And these papyri, and we have many of them. We have the admonitions of Ipuwer. We have the maxims of Kakaparasone. All of these date from the Middle Kingdom after the first intermediate period is over. So what these later texts in the Middle Kingdom are saying is like, oh, look how things really just completely fell apart when there was no king, when there was no, savior figure in the role of the king. But now that things are good, you can actually take heart in the fact that, oh, look how things used to be. So it's absolutely a work of propaganda, literary propaganda, saying, oh, you better be happy with what you got now, because now we have a king under all the Amenemhets and all of the Montehoteps and the Senwosrits. All of these guys are keeping things together. But the scribes of this time are writing literature that are rather depressing, to be honest. And so you really have to kind of take note of, what was the true intention of writing this down? Who was the audience? Who was the audience of this papyrus, of this man who is contemplating suicide? Why would he write it down? So that's one of the reasons, or one of the texts that really speaks to me. Another one, and then I'll finish up. Another one is from the 19th dynasty. We've got this wonderful genre of love poetry, where there's this one line from a love poem where the beloved says to the woman that he's interested in, that I am made drunk and I need not wine because of the love of you. So, I mean, we've all felt that kind of emotion, that kind of passion, that kind of regret. We have letters to the dead, specifically from Deir Medina, the very famous town of the workmen's village who built the Valley of the Kings. We have these amazing, like tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of ostraca that are still being studied. Still, many of them are unpublished. They're still being studied and they're still being used. And so you have, potsherds or even entire bowls that have a letter from a wife to her husband who is dead, and she's angry at him because his son is being lazy and not doing the job and not supporting the household. So you're even just because you're dead in ancient Egypt doesn't mean you're gone.
Right.
And so
so you're still receiving these letters even into your posthumous period. That's actually a very interesting idea. It makes total sense when you believe the body is still, or the soul rather is still alive, right? Then why not write to those individuals that you're assuming that they can receive your complaint for your son's laziness? I want to come to the questions, and we've received a couple, and let me just encourage anyone else who has questions to please chat them in. Tom Smith wants to know, how close to the truth is the glass opera Akhenaten, if you're familiar with that opera?
I am familiar with the opera. I actually have it on an antiquated CD. I haven't actually seen the actual recent performance at the Met. I've still been trying to find it, but I can't find it. I would say it is romanticized, and I'm very cautious about my own bias of romanticizing the Egyptians and the Nubians and the people of the ancient Northeast African region, because I am fascinated. I am invested. I got into this when I was 15 years of age, so I've got quite a bit of history invested, intellectual history and emotional history. You try to want to tone down those emotions though, because then you'll start getting biases that aren't necessarily reflective of the truth and the facts that we have on the ground. That one, the Philip Glass's opera, I saw an older recording. I didn't see the most recent one that came out, 4 years ago? I saw an older recording. And it's an opera. It's a drama. It is romanticized. As far as the major pivotal moments in the life of the drama of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, the conflict and the contrast with the priests and the establishment of the normal Egyptian system, and how Akhenaten kind of overturned that, is pretty solid. I think Glass did a really beautiful job with very haunting music, by the way.
So we have another question of your commentary regarding appropriate museum presentation of ancient artifacts. How well does the approach taken by U of C's own institution, the Oriental Institute, match up with disciplinary best practices to the extent that you are familiar? And if such could be improved locally, what would be your recommendation?
Oh, that's a good idea. That's actually a really excellent question. The OI's collection is magnificent. I have found it to be more chronological, which to me it makes more sense, because then you can see how things, objects, themes change over time. I'm not a registrar, I'm not a curator. I don't have a strong background in museology, but from the trips that I've taken from the Graham School and from other institutions, the Art Institute and the Illinois Institute of Art, I've taken my students to the Oriental Institute over 12 years, 15 years now. And I think it helps for the non-specialist to kind of understand and see that evolution and that progression of not only different material, whether it is the development of faience, or it's the introduction of lapis lazuli, which comes from Afghanistan, or it's the introduction and the first appearance of A group and C group Nubian culture being integrated and used in the Nile Valley itself, in Egypt itself. So you've got this crossover of ethnicity. And this is something I tell my students very cautiously. and this is where they need to start thinking about the material that we're looking at. Pots don't always equal people, right? So if you are someone in Thailand who has a Coca-Cola bottle, Coca-Cola is a brand from Georgia here in the United States. Does that mean a Georgian actually consumed that Coca-Cola soft drink? No, it doesn't. The same thing can tentatively, very cautiously be said about ceramics. Ceramic morphology or ceramic assemblages can be spread and not necessarily be used by the people who made them. Nubians might make Pangrave ceramics, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that specific assemblage is used just by Nubians who were also living in Egypt at the time. So these things do cross over from a material perspective, from a ceramics perspective. Um, and this can get very interesting in the assemblages that we have in museums. But as far as getting back to the question, not to belabor the point, I think the Oriental Institute is actually doing a really nice job in presenting material to people who might not be very familiar with the chronology of Egypt or the material culture of Egypt. I think it's doing a really nice job. And of course, we do have cases that are thematic. We have cases of, that have tools in them. We have writing implements in them. We have funerary goods. We have the cases with, some beautiful bronze images of the gods and goddesses. So those are actually very useful as well. And those are presented outside of a chronological linear context. So I would say, honestly, both. I prefer both. The linear context as an introductory whole, I think, helps to contextualize what you're going to see in the thematic vitrines and the thematic cases.
So we have another question here, which is about how your understanding of ancient Egypt, which I think is always a question that historians and archaeologists are asked about, how that influences, if at all, how you look at the world today. How does it kind of contextualize in some ways how you look at modern society and how we deal with issues in our world?
That's a very profound question. Very existential. Okay. I would say my first exposure, and I will briefly, I promise I'll be brief. Sometimes I tend to ramble, if you haven't noticed. My first exposure to non-Western, non-American culture was in India. And I've always been fascinated by, watching National Geographic when I was a kid and blah, blah, blah. I grew up in a small town in Arkansas. So not a lot of cultural diversity or educational opportunities. My hometown was like 2,800 people. And so I finally got the opportunity to travel with University of Pennsylvania University Museum under the direction of Dr. Gregory Purcell, who was studying in Mohenjo-Daro Harappan cultures in Western India, in the Western Indian desert. And that was my first exposure, not only to another culture where I had to learn some rudimentary Hindi, right, to just kind of get along because I'm in their country. I'm not going to expect or demand that they speak English to me. We were also in a rural area, which did not have a lot of English speakers.
Yeah.
And so I had to make those modifications, and I was happy to. It was joyful. I absolutely loved it. And I think that those lessons in India and Thailand, I oversaw an excavation because I was an undergrad and everybody else was a grad school at UPenn. They're like, okay, Brian, we're going to be looking at the copper smelting site where we're smelting copper and creating ingots and bronze and all this other stuff. This is approximately 2200 BCE in Southeast Asia. So what the director said is like, okay, Brian, you're going to go down to the cornfields, which have just been mown, right? So the corn's already been harvested, and we're expecting you maybe to find some post holes, maybe some ceramics, some flint tools. I excavated 7 human burials.
Wow.
They did not expect for the human burials to be underneath the houses, which were on stilts. So you've got these post holes that are in the ground, these dark round stains, which are the remains of some sort of wood material, which would then support the house above the floodwater. We had a river nearby, so that was a concern for people 4,000 years ago. But they're also burying their dead underneath their homes in the
Yeah.
floors of homes. So all of these things, and again, I try not to be too biased, too emotional. It's kind of difficult for me. I get passionate about this, and I see these people as real people. One of the burials that I was able to excavate was a mother and her infant, was prenatal, so a premature birth. The infant was placed inside of a small broken pot over the mother's womb. So we're talking about rebirth mythology, right? Or the rebirth ideology, where the pot mimics the womb itself, the uterus itself. The infant's body was placed inside the pot. And then the day after we covered everything over to excavate for the next day, I come back and there's a fistful of incense from my workmen stuck in the edge of the excavation pit.
Mm.
They're paying their respects to their ancestors, and they know how long ago these people lived. And so
Yeah.
it's those experiences with the ancient and with the modern people that I encounter, that I talk to, that keep me going.
Well, that may be a very perfect place to finish our conversation, because I think this idea of life and death and the profound role that it plays in ancient Egypt is ultimately at the core of what energizes the religious practice. It's what gives people insight into the Nile and the rising of the sun, and how we make sense of our world. And in many ways, I think one of the greatest insights as we look at how other people made sense of their worlds is then, as we look in the mirror to think about how we make sense of ours, and, how we will be viewed as, people come back to look at our civilization. So thank you. You're seeing in the chat many other thanks. We are very fortunate to have a conversation with you, and even more fortunate that you are an instructor who brings this insight to our learners at Graham. And thank you all for joining us. Looking forward to seeing some of you hopefully on Friday when we have our first Friday lecture from our Director of Academics at Graham, Zoe Eisenman, on Polybus. Looking forward to seeing many of you then. Again, Brian, thank you for an insightful afternoon.
Thank you very much, Seth. Thanks all for joining. I really appreciate it.